money to start up labs. It's getting cheaper and cheaper to do that. And so you can do it with fewer people, and they're effective. I mean, that's what people argue, that both chemical and biological weapons would be an effective terror weapon.
This is an emergency broadcast. This is not a test.
Welcome everybody to the Dad's Doomsday Guide. Today we're covering chemical and biological weapons with Dr. Marie Chevrier. Before we get started, we wanted to let you know we just launched our Patreon page. If you're enjoying the podcast and would like to support us, we'd really appreciate it. We're looking to start creating much more content for the show, as well as making further improvements, and your support will help us do that. So thank you. If you're checking us out for the first time, make sure you click that like button and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube, or follow us on whatever podcasting platform you're listening on. Today's guest, Dr. Marie Chevrier, is a professor and chair of the Department of Public Policy and Administration at Rutgers University Camden. Marie is a member and former chair of the Scientists Working Group on Biological and Chemical Weapons in Washington, D.C. Dr. Chevrier's research on negotiations has appeared in Politics and the Life Science, the Non-Proliferation Review, Arms Control Today, the Washington Post, and several others. Dr. Chevrier has given lectures and workshops at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Princeton University, Harvard University, and the London School of Economics. We thank Dr. Chevrier for taking the time to speak with us, and we hope you enjoy it. I guess if we could start, Marie, just by kind of letting everybody know who you are, what you do, maybe how you came to be in this field that we're talking about today, which is kind of, I don't know if I'd say exotic, but it's not every day that you meet someone who's involved in this. So how did you end up here?
Well, I was in graduate school in the late 80s, and I was concerned about weapons of mass destruction. There were a lot of people who were working on nuclear weapons, and I wasn't really interested in U.S.-Soviet at that time negotiations. I was interested in multilateral negotiations on weapons of mass destruction. So my PhD advisor was very involved with chemical and biological weapons arms control. And so he suggested that I work on biological because my background had more biology than it did chemistry. So that's how I got into looking at the treaty that bans the possession, use, production, etc., of biological weapons. And after I finished my dissertation, which was the Biological Weapons Convention the best way to control these weapons internationally? And I went on to continue to publish on biological weapons and biological arms control primarily, and then took on more of the chemical weapons when I wrote a as yet unpublished book on the history of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Okay.
And when you talk about you said the Biological Weapons Convention, and then I believe you're right, there's a Chemical Weapons Convention as well?
Yes.
And now who are these, I guess, people, and what are they tasked with? Because I was unaware that these things existed until I was reading about it, and I was like, oh, this is how they're supposed to control it.
So let's start with the Biological Weapons Convention, because it's older than the Chemical Weapons Convention. It was signed in 1972 and went into effect in 1975. Basically, the U.S. had abandoned its offensive biological weapons program under President Nixon. And so the U.S. did that because they did not really see a military use for chemical weapons, biological weapons. Oh my gosh, if I keep... they didn't see a military use for biological weapons because they felt that their nuclear chemical weapons capabilities would more than be sufficient, that they didn't need biological weapons. So the U.S. assumed the Soviet Union thought the same way. And so they signed a treaty. It's a multilateral treaty. It's got about 160 parties worldwide that agree not to possess, develop, stockpile biological weapons. It had no implementing structure when it first entered into force, that any complaints about the possession or use of biological weapons were to be sent to the Security Council, where, of course, the United Nations Security Council, all 5 permanent members of the Security Council have the ability to veto anything. So that's the US, China, UK, France, and now Russia was the Soviet Union at the time.
Okay.
In the meantime, negotiations to ban chemical weapons were underway, and a treaty to ban chemical weapons, the same thing, development, stockpiling, use, etc., was completed in 1993, and it went into force in 1997. Now, that treaty required all states who possess chemical weapons to declare what they possess. And at the time, the international community thought that really only the US, and by this time Russia, possessed chemical weapons. It turned out there were a half dozen or so countries that declared that they possess chemical weapons. And so they declare what they have to an organization that was created by the treaty, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which has a 7-story, 8-story building in The Hague with hundreds of employees. And their job was to first verify the destruction of chemical weapons and chemical weapons production facilities. So they went around the world and said, oh, yes, you have what you said you had, and you are in the process of destroying it. Originally, there were requirements to destroy chemical weapons by 2007. That got pushed back to 2012. Then it got pushed back again. And the U.S. still has a few munitions containing mustard and nerve gas, which it's in the process of destroying. But it just took much longer than anyone anticipated.
Is that because nobody trusts that the other parties are doing it? Or because obviously with all these treaties, I feel like there's an element of kind of the face value of, oh, hey, we're doing this, but really we're not. I mean, is that really the kind of the gist of it? Or?
Well, no, not really. Because chemical weapons, the OPCW, Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons.
It's a mouthful. It's good you get abbreviated.
Because the OPCW sent inspectors, which were international, to destruction sites, they were able to look at what the possessor had in terms of chemical weapons and verify the technology to destroy it and observe that.
Okay.
So one problem was nobody had any really good technology to destroy chemical weapons. It turned out to be the cheapest and the easiest was incineration. But when you incinerated or burned chemical weapons, you were left with not so good remnants of that destruction. And people protested the destruction of chemical weapons, particularly by incineration, where they were stored. So they were stored in various places in the United States and various places around the world. And both in the United States and in Russia, there were some NIMBY, not in my backyard. We've been storing these chemical weapons and bearing that risk for all these years. We don't want to risk the consequences of the destruction of chemical weapons as well. It's long and complicated, but that's sort of the gist of it. They then looked at other technologies, which were more expensive, but they wanted to make sure that they were less prone to NIMBY objections. And finally, Russia declared that it had destroyed all of its chemical weapons, but nobody in the United States believes that that was really the case. Keep in mind that not every country in the world is party to these treaties. The Chemical Weapons Treaty or Convention has more parties than the Biological Weapons Convention, but there are a few key states like Israel who are not parties to the Chemical Weapons Convention. North Korea, of course, is not. They do whatever they want.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I was
My
talking.
guess is that they have chemical weapons because they're not that difficult to produce or store. Biological weapons, on the other hand, are more difficult to produce and store. And that's one of the reasons why we haven't seen biological weapons used very often.
Uh-huh.
We haven't seen them used on the battlefield really since the First World War, where they used diseases that affect horses to decimate the cavalries.
Interesting.
Or at least they tried to. There have been a couple of instances of attempted terrorist use of biological weapons, and I use that word quite specifically because of my definition of terrorism. And one was in Oregon when the Rajneeshi sect used, I'm going to forget the agent. Anyway, they caused food poisoning in a town in Oregon, the Dalles, because they wanted to affect voting in that town. So people got food poisoning. It didn't kill people, or it didn't kill very many people, but a lot of people got sick. And it wasn't until someone in the Rajneeshi sect basically outed the fact that they had grown these food poisoning germs and put it into salad bars in the Dalles in order to make people sick.
So would you classify, I guess, group use, a small group trying to use these type of things as, I guess, terrorism in that sense for biological and chemical purposes? Or...
Well, my definition of terrorism is that it is an act by an individual or a group, actually. Okay. Individuals can certainly commit terrorism that is against the law, regardless of what it is that you're doing, and that it's done for a political purpose and to install fear beyond the people who are affected by the chemical or biological agent that is used.
Gotcha.
So, it's because of the political purposes that the Rajneeshi sect, who wanted people not to vote, that's a political purpose, right? Mm-hmm. So that's why it checks that box as well as the rest of the boxes in terrorism. And that's pretty much Bruce Hoffman's definition of terrorism. And he's sort of written more on terrorism, at least earlier on than today, than a lot of other people. And I still like his definition of terrorism.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Israel as being not part of that convention or the treaty, because when I was talking to about nuclear weapons with Dr. David Welch, he had mentioned, I asked him, where do you think in the world there could be a nuclear use of a nuclear weapon, what the odds are, and it's all conjecture, so you really don't know. But he was like, if you look at the landscape, he could see the Middle East, Israel, something kind of popping off in that region to where someone would use a nuclear weapon if someone's back was against the wall. So it's interesting when you start looking at these, we always think of the big United States, Russia, what are we doing and what threats are we posing? But you forget about all the little countries and all the conflicts going around and who's pursuing what. It's easy to get lost in like who has what is going on here, So how easy is chemical and biological? I imagine, like you mentioned before, biological is much more difficult to control. And I know that's kind of been the attitude when of people I've talked to is that, oh, no one's really going to use this because of the potential blowback to them, right? You release a nerve gas, or maybe that's more chemical, but you'll release something, then it starts infecting you guys too. Is there truth to that, or is science getting to the point now where you can control these things and it's getting more realistic to use?
Let's get a little bit into the science, but not very far, because I'm not a scientist.
Sounds good to me.
Biological weapons are harder because only some of them are infectious. Chemical weapons are not infectious at all. You can't catch a chemical weapons effective chemical weapons by hanging out with someone who also has chemical weapons, unless it's on their skin, nerve gas on their skin, and you touch it. But that's, doesn't happen very often. Mm-hmm. Biological weapons are typically alive. So one of the reasons that anthrax always pops up as an ideal biological weapon is because the biological agent that causes anthrax has different life stages. And one of them is a spore. And the spore is very hardy in the environment. It can last for decades in the soil. And if you breathe it in or get it into your bloodstream through a cut or something like that, then it changes its form from a spore to an active bacterium. And it, depending on if you breathe it in, and it affects your lungs, and that's different than if you get it in a cut in your skin.
Jeez.
getting it in your lungs is much more serious and much more likely to lead to death because it creates a poison. And that poison or toxin is what ultimately kills you after you breathe it in.
Okay.
And also, biological agents differ from chemicals as well in that biological agents typically have a incubation period, so to speak. It has to get into your system. It has to multiply. It has to then affect whatever organs or systems the agent, whether it's a virus or a bacterium or rickettsia. I don't know very much about rickettsia, but there are different organisms that will either affect you or kill you, affect you without killing you or affect you.
Jeez.
So it doesn't have much battlefield use because on a battlefield, you don't want people to be affected in 2 or 3 days. You want them knocked out quickly. And that's where chemical agents come in.
Okay.
And, yeah.
So you maybe view biological weapons as more like assassination tools or acts of terrorism, like fear and like that kind of realm?
That's certainly how they have mostly been used. They have been used recently as assassination weapons in the UK, where Russia, as far as we know, dispatched a couple of assassins and affected Skripal, and his daughter Skripal died. So people can look that up. All you have to look up is Novichok, Novichuk, and it's an agent that was developed by the Soviet Union in the 1980s, I think, and is currently a binary chemical weapons in that it has 2 chemicals that are not lethal on their own, but when they are mixed, then they kill you. So typically they're in a munition, if you wanted to use them on the battlefield, where the chemicals are separate. And then when they are fired, they're fired in a way that mixes the chemicals, and then that's what kills you.
Interesting.
But they haven't been, battlefield chemical weapons have not been used, I think I'll get this right, since the Iran-Iraq War.
Okay.
So Iraq used and started the use of chemical weapons and used many more chemical weapons against the Iranians than the Iranians, in retaliation for Iraqi use of chemical weapons, started producing their own chemical weapons and using them against the Iraqis. So in the 80s, we were particularly happy to have Iran and Iraq fighting each other because we didn't like either one. So we didn't do much about that war.
Yeah, the chemical, the human rights stuff. Yeah, just go for it, guys. So when you talk about...
It was before the Chemical Weapons Convention took effect. So in fact, it was before the Chemical Weapons Convention was written. But it was a real impetus to the Chemical Weapons Convention. And Iran is still a very strong advocate for the Chemical Weapons Convention because they suffered so much, particularly initially from the Iraqi chemical weapons.
Interesting. And so when you talk about anthrax, because that's, like you said, used or talked about so widely, I mean, from people getting it in the mail and like everything, is there any warning signs? I mean, is it basically like this kind of silent, I mean, it could be anywhere, like a little bit of dust in your hand is going to get you sick. I mean, because I remember there's a lot of fear when I think politicians were getting letters and there was like anthrax inside or the fear of it. And then there was a lot of talk about how easily it can be passed around and acts of terror. How easy is that? Was it kind of hyped up, or is it that serious and that deadly of an agent?
It's that deadly, but it has not been shown to be as easy as people think.
Okay.
So so there are different stages in the production of anthrax, and I don't know firsthand the details of how to produce anthrax, although my husband suggests that it might be in our refrigerator from time to time. It's both difficult to produce. And so once you produce the bacterium, then you have to get it in spore form. Once it's in spore form, it's heavier than air. So you don't breathe it in unless you have a way of making that spore sort of a super spore, which is what the U.S. Defense Department did, and which is what the letters are alleged to have had, so that when you open the letter, it wouldn't just drift up into your nose and mouth and breathe it in. A number of the people in 2001 who were affected by the anthrax letters, the people who died basically breathed it in. Some had cutaneous anthrax, or it would go into an opening in your skin. So if you had it on your skin in your hand and you didn't have any cuts or abrasions on your hand, you wouldn't get anthrax. But if you had a little sore, like I have on my thumb right now, it could get into that and cause cutaneous anthrax, which is much less deadly than inhalation anthrax. So yes, there are warning signs. And if you have it in your skin, it's pretty easy to cure with antibiotics because it's a bacteria, right?
Uh-huh.
If you have it in your lungs, you usually don't show symptoms until after the toxin or the poison is produced. So it's harder or impossible to cure. It's very difficult to cure if you have inhalation anthrax and it's already producing the toxin.
And there's no way. I'm sorry. There's no way for people, like you said it's heavier than air at that point. I mean, there's no way that people can manipulate it to where it is kind of almost like vaporized, to where you do open something and you breathe it in, or is it always in that form? It's always going to be pretty like heavy.
If you were in an area where anthrax was endemic, it existed naturally. And typically anthrax is a disease of cattle and sheep. So, it's endemic in some places, but people don't worry about it because it doesn't, people don't sort of know it's there or how much, and it doesn't get sort of into a form that you could breathe it in. If you breathe in the spores, it's deadly, but it hasn't occurred. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
One instance of a group trying to make and distribute anthrax was the Om Shinrikyo sect in Japan in the mid-1990s. They tried to produce anthrax and distribute it in the subway in Tokyo or the subway in somewhere else in Japan. But they failed. It didn't make anybody sick. And so they switched from biological to chemical. And even when they were producing nerve agent is volatile and quite deadly, even if you just get it on your protected skin. You can absorb it through your skin.
Oh, wow.
I can remember the day that they announced that it was discovered that there was a chemical weapons attack in the subway in Tokyo, and it was nerve agent. My husband said, somebody spread chemical weapons in the Tokyo subway, a nerve agent. 5 people are dead. And I said, I don't think it's a nerve agent. There aren't enough dead people. If it's in the air and you breathe it in a subway car, everybody in that subway car is going to die.
Jeez.
So we later found out that they didn't do a very good job of producing the chemical, and they didn't place it in the right place in the subway car. And so it was less likely to affect people. I mean, people did die, and it certainly created the kind of chaos that Om Shinrikyo was trying to produce. And once again, for terrorist purposes, I mean, they sort of wanted to take over the government of Japan. I mean, it was a crazy sect, which is now pretty completely destroyed.
When you say nerve agent, I know we're kind of bouncing around here. I apologize for that, but that's kind of where my head's at with this subject. When you say nerve agent, are there different types, or is this just one thing you're talking about? There
are different of nerve agent that they all affect the nervous system, however. So there's VX, and they have different letters attached to their name. Novichok is a nerve agent, but it's a binary nerve agent. So what it does is it affects the way your neurotransmitters function, and it affects the autonomic nervous system, and you don't breathe and you die, or you have convulsions and you die. Yeah.
And is that pretty instantaneous? There's no like antidote? I mean, once you're exposed and it's done?
There are antidotes, but you have to use them very quickly. Okay. Most of us don't carry around nerve.
You have to be an international spy for that.
Yeah. I know those of you who might be listening, I don't really know much about those at all. I might be mistaken.
So nerve agents would be classified as chemical weapons.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
So we saw the first massive use of chemical weapons, even though there was an agreement, the Hague Agreement of, I think it was 1895 or 1898. It was the very late 1800s. That you couldn't have projectiles with chemical agent in them. And so in World War I, the Germans first used, they did not use, nerve agents had not yet been developed. And so they used blister agent, mustard, and other kinds of agents that caused blistering in your lungs if you breathed it in. And they basically opened up containers on the battlefield so they weren't in projectiles.
Oh,
well,
wow.
that didn't last long. Pretty soon, the Brits, the US, the Germans, everybody was using chemical agents, but they were not using nerve agents. And the other chemical agents at the time were not nearly as lethal. So a lot of people who were exposed to chemical agents at that time did not die. Nerve agents were developed by the Germans before World War II, but none of the major belligerents used chemical weapons in World War II. The Italians used them against the Ethiopians when that was part of World War II or part of, early World War II. None of the other belligerents really used chemical weapons. Nobody really knows why Hitler didn't use chemical weapons.
Yeah.
One theory is that he was exposed to chemical weapons in World War I.
Oh.
And he was not a fan of chemical weapons. So
well, that's where he drew the line. He was like, no chemical weapons.
I guess so. So then you kind of fast forward to Vietnam. The U.S. did not use anti-personnel chemical weapons. So they didn't use they didn't use chemicals that would kill people. But certainly napalm could be described as a chemical weapon, even though it's an incendiary weapon. It creates fire, which burns down jungle. So it's not included in the ban on chemical agents because the U.S. didn't want to be accused of using chemical weapons in Vietnam, even though at that time the U.S. was not a party to, well, there was no chemical weapons convention, but there was the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which the protocol banned the use of chemical and biological weapons against adversaries unless the adversary used chemical or biological weapons against you first.
When you talk about the chemical weapons, you have the nerve agents, and then is there just a ton of different ones, various ones, or are there a couple that are...
There's more like a half dozen.
Okay. And then when you talk about biological, how many actually, besides anthrax, are there that actually are used? And are they always developing new ones? I mean, how fluid is that?
No. I mean, either they're not or we don't know about it.
Okay.
There's certainly evidence and allegations that COVID was produced and developed in a Chinese lab.
Because it was frustrating to me because, like, putting just politics aside and everything, just as a person, like, just wondering what the truth is, and there's so many games being played about what we know, what we're going to tell the public we know, the optics of whether or not our hands are a little dirty because we're over there doing stuff we shouldn't be doing. Like, where do you see the truth? Because it's so hard to come by these days.
I still have questions just like you do. So I think that the probability that it was created in a lab in China is greater than the probability that it was a naturally occurring agent in a wet market in China.
And why do you think that?
Well, because there just isn't evidence from the wet market that it was there. And there's evidence that, there are these labs in China. They did work on viruses. What viruses did they work on? And then after that, it's kind of hard to get evidence after that.
Yeah, I know they're so shut off. I mean, normally if it was just like another country, you could be like, hey, what happened here? And I mean, do you think that the United States has been kind of fuzzy about it because there's talk about the NIH, I guess, being involved over there or funding it, and then they just didn't have the security measures and it got out of hand and then it leaked out. I mean, I guess if you could, I know you don't know for sure, but give us your best scenario about what do you think happened and how it got out?
Well,
or hypothetically, how would one of these things happen, I guess? Because that's the fear is like, right, this whole gain of function thing, is it going to happen again? Who's actually studying these things?
Well,
because
yeah.
None of this is banned, right? Because it's not technically a weapon. It's just research, right? For like even
Biological Weapons Convention does not ban research.
Mm.
So you can research on any agent that you want. However, development into an agent and any gain of function to make it more deadly, more infectious, those are the two that are really of concern. So any experiments of concern would be those that made it more deadly or more easily passed from one person to another.
Before you go kind of give your hypothetical, could you explain to people listening what is gain of function? Because I know there's a lot of confusion and kind of different things being, especially at the height of COVID, everything was kind of thrown around and terms were being changed, it seemed like. What is it to you?
Well, gain of function would be putting something in the agent, whether it's a virus or a bacteria, that would make it more resistant to antibiotics, for instance. Now, of course, viruses are not killed by antibiotics. So, and there are some antivirals, but if you sort of tried to beat vaccines, for instance, if you tried to create an agent that would no longer be affected by a vaccine, that would be a gain of function that we would really worry about. So those are the kinds of things that we worry at, making it more deadly, making it more likely to not be affected by vaccines, or make it more easily passed from person to person. Those are the gains of function that we worry about the most. So COVID, as you know, is very infectious, as well as it's not really deadly in comparison to, particularly now, because there are now vaccines that make it much less deadly if you get it. I'm 71 years old and I've had COVID twice. And because I was vaccinated and boosted, I had very mild symptoms. I was, I didn't feel very good for a couple of days and I felt tired for a couple of weeks. And that was sort of the extent of my COVID disease.
I read an article, and it's kind of, maybe it's a little inflammatory, but they were saying basically gain of function is the new term, what used to be called biological weapons research. Now they've just kind of changed the name to be allowed kind of to do it. And everybody's doing it kind of, there's obviously, they're trying to stay ahead of nature in terms of what could come and how we're going to make, vaccines and whatever else. But is there an element there that people are using that as cover to continue some type of weapons research?
Gain of function would certainly be considered biological weapons research, because why else would you do it?
Yeah.
Keep in mind that the whole ability to isolate genes and insert genes into viruses is a pretty new phenomenon. It's pretty 21st century. It was being done in the 90s, but not very often and not very well. So it's a real modern phenomenon. So to the extent that the Biological Weapons Convention has been in force for, since the 1970s, how much research on biological weapons is actually going on is unclear. One of the things that you have to look at is political, like who in the weapons establishment in your country is an advocate for getting money from the government to do this kind of research. Mm-hmm. And the U.S. pretty much doesn't have people who are interested in this very much. There are still people theoretically that do research on biological agents in order to prepare against them.
Okay.
So that's the reason why you're still allowed to do research, is because it's considered defensive in terms of developing prophylactics against potential agents that might be used as weapons. So back to sort of anthrax as the ideal weapon, when there are who knows how many agents there are out there. What we know about them mostly comes from investigating the history of the biological weapons program and the biological weapons programs of other countries. So you have the Soviet Union, who even after the Biological Weapons Convention went into force, worked on smallpox as a biological weapon, which would be horrible because it's very infectious. And if you were born after, maybe sometime in the 1980s, you haven't had a smallpox vaccine.
When you talk about these main ones, right? Anthrax, smallpox, do you think and with the new technology and genes, are they trying more so to manipulate these ones? Or instead of creating like new, variants that we've never heard of, do you think that the odds are they're trying to make these or seeing where these could go versus something new? Are we still going to deal with the old ones, right, moving forward in the future?
Well, it depends on who you're looking at and the sophistication of their scientific infrastructure. So if I'm looking at North Korea or Syria, Syria clearly had and used nerve agents and blister agents, and chlorine. Chlorine is neither a blister agent or, could be considered a blister, I guess. Anyway, it's deadly if you breathe it in certain concentrations. Syria got rid of all of its nerve agents that we know of after Russia, interestingly enough, and the United States and Germany and Sweden and all kinds of other countries contributed to the ability of Syria to become a party or accede to the Chemical Weapons Convention, declare what it had in terms of chemical weapons, and have the destruction of those chemical weapons supervised by the OPCW. It did that, but it sort of retained some of them, like chlorine, so it could continue to drop barrel bombs of chlorine on its own citizens,
Jeez.
Which it did after it joined the Chemical Weapons Convention.
Man. So basically the old, some of those other countries would gravitate more toward the old style, old school agents, and maybe some of these more developed countries are going to be looking for more exotic new things?
Yes.
Would that be fair?
I mean, China has a very sophisticated scientific infrastructure. So it's able to, it has virus labs. I mean, you want to have any lab that's working with dangerous agents have sufficient safety in place so that you don't have an accidental release.
Do you feel like it is inevitable that we're going to have more either lab leaks, like what potentially happened with China, and or attacks where chemical and biological weapons are used as the science gets better and people are able to control this better? Or is this something we have to be not afraid of? Because with this show, it's like we want to expose people to kind of these extreme scenarios. We don't want people to be unnecessarily afraid. But I mean, is there a risk that this stuff is going to increase?
I think that the probability increases, but I don't think it gets to the level of inevitable. We are likely to have, I think, more lab releases that cause disease, but not necessarily anything big, because the technology has now spread so widely that it's harder for communities to figure out how to safeguard biological research in general. If you're in Turkey or Syria and you're doing something clandestine and there's a big earthquake, who knows what's going to happen to those agents that you're working on? It depends on the level of security that you have in your lab, the level of expertise that you have in your lab. The empirical evidence is that it's harder than it seems, and that you have to be it's harder than it seems to those of us who are not microbiologists or biochemists and don't have the lab experience to know all of the things that would make it not work to our satisfaction. So we're likely to see assassinations as we have, and because there were no consequences. I mean, people, said, Russia did this, and Russia said, no, we didn't. And that was sort of the end of it. It's not something that was actively pursued by Britain, who it was on Britain's soil. So theoretically, they could charge someone in Russia with crimes so that if Putin ever set foot in the UK, he could be arrested.
And are those assassinations, I mean, I know you have no way of really knowing this, but are these happening with these kind of agents more than the public is being led to? I mean, unless it's like hitting the mainstream newspapers and we're like, oh my God, someone got poisoned. Are these things being used more often than we know about?
I don't think so. I mean,
Okay.
we found out about the very strange North Korean attempt to assassinate somebody by having these very naive young women go and spread stuff in the airport. And
Oh, I think I remember that. Yeah. Were they trying to like not kiss someone or hug someone or getting really close to them to like spread it? Was that what they were doing?
they try all kinds of things. They put it on doorknobs, but they're not very good at it. And so it either doesn't work or somebody gets sick but doesn't die because it's not a very good agent, or they haven't figured out all of the details that would make it a prime usage.
Okay.
But it's not too hard to poison somebody. It's just a question of what kind of poison do you use, right?
Yeah. 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 I remember some terrible article, and this isn't related to like biological or chemical weapons, but it was like this woman poisoned her husband by putting like some drops of something in water over like a really long period of time. I forget what it was, but he ended up killing him. And I was like, geez, man. It's like, yeah. Be nice to people, I guess, right? Because you never want to be on that receiving end. Now, for these labs, are these mostly just overseas, or are there any operating in the United States and we just don't know?
These labs is kind of vague. So there are the World Health Organization has various biosafety levels, and the highest is 5. So you want to prevent stuff from coming in, and you want to prevent stuff from going out. Mm-hmm. And there's lots of things that you have to put in place to assure that. There are not very many biosafety level 5 labs, but there are lots of 4s, which is just one down, and they're being built all over the world, including the United States, where they work on dangerous pathogens. And that's probably what happened in China, is that it was a reputable lab working on viruses, and somebody carved out a little piece of that lab to work on COVID. That's my guess. Or it could have just been they were, looking at the family of viruses and something leaked. They might not even have been trying to create any kind of a biological weapon.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought process to go down, because you think like just as more and more accumulates and more people have them, and you have continuing conflicts, like what are the odds of something being released, whether it's a hot-headed leader or if it's by accident? It starts to make you go, geez, between like nuclear weapons and all these other ones, it's like all these heinous things that exist.
We tend to be more afraid than the empirical evidence perhaps warrants. But there are people who have as much or more expertise than I do who are much more afraid than I am.
They raise the alarm bells and just say, what, it's imminent? Is that their big concern? Is that someone's going to use one of these things?
Yeah.
Okay. And what would be what's the counterpoint to your not being worried? What is the best argument to be worried?
The past doesn't predict the future. The science is spreading quickly all over the world. Money to start up labs. It's getting cheaper and cheaper to do that. And so you can do it with fewer people. So, and they're effective. I mean, that's what people argue, that both chemical and biological weapons would be an effective terror weapon.
God, yeah.
Biological, not so much a battlefield weapon, but chemical battlefield weapon. What chemicals are not good at are if you have troops that have chemical gear, gas masks, and protective clothing, they're going to be fine. I mean, that's what happened in Iraq and Iran. When Iraq first started using chemical weapons, the Iranians really didn't have any chemical protective gear. And as soon as they did, the effectiveness of the chemical attacks went way down.
Okay. When they release those chemical weapons, how long do they stay in the soil or in the air, or where you have to keep wearing that stuff?
They're volatile. In other words, they spread out in the air. Mm-hmm. So it's so that they become much, much more dilute over
over a pretty short period of time, actually.
Okay.
I'm just thinking of the Tokyo subway, where they did have nerve gas in the Tokyo subway, but it was, it was heavier than air, and so it just sort of fell. But it doesn't kick up to your breathing passages, so to speak,
Okay.
your nose and your mouth.
Okay. And then for exposures, is there anything, if you had, so protective gear would cover yourself against any kind of chemical attack or like gas masks and whatnot. Are there, and then for biological, I presume some antibiotics would work. Are there things that
Antibiotics would only work if it was a bacteria, because they don't work on viruses.
That's yeah. So if you had someone released, is there a concern for you, like if you had to pick one thing from a biological point of view and one chemical agent, are there things that just you can't do anything about, or is there always a counter to these kind of attacks? Is there always an antidote, basically?
Well, I would worry about smallpox a lot. Humans are the only species that get smallpox.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's been vaccinated for 30, 40 years. So everybody's vulnerable. There's no animal reservoir. So it's safer in some ways to just project it against another country.
Mm.
And there aren't good countermeasures to smallpox that I know of.
When you talk about people with labs and they're doing research on kind of already existing or known viruses or bacteria or agents, does any scientists actually go out into like these remote areas where you see viruses popping up or things jumping from like animals to humans? Are they actively trying to harness or find new pathogens or weird things out there and bring them back to a lab and study them?
Yeah, I think they are trying to do that. We have avian flu right now, which used to only affect birds, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we've been studying avian flu since there was an outbreak in humans, and now it's and flu's a virus. It's their antibiotics don't work. Flu kills a lot of people every year, naturally occurring flu.
Yeah, and I know they probably are doing that to try to stay ahead of maybe the evolution of these viruses.
Sure, and to work on vaccines, because you can get vaccines against viruses, obviously.
Do you agree with that approach? Do you feel like all this research that's being done, right, whether it's clandestine for kind of a weapons program or it's because we want to do good with humanity, we want to stay ahead of these things? Do you feel like things are on the right track, or do you feel like you guys need to pump the brakes a little bit here?
Well, I think there's some of both. So scientists went and were able to extract the virus, the flu virus that caused the 1918-1919 massive flu epidemic, which killed like 20 million people worldwide.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there were reasons for that. Well, now they're trying to reconstruct that virus in a lab. Now, I don't think they should do that. I really don't.
I didn't know they were doing that. Why are they doing that?
Well, they have their reasons, which, it's like, well, would tell us something about infectious viruses, infectious flu viruses. That science in 1918, 1919 wasn't anything like the science now. We could learn something from it. That's the argument as to why they didn't destroy the last stocks of smallpox when they had the opportunity to do so in the 1970s. It's like, no, let's keep some in CDC and let's keep some in I'm forgetting the name of the Soviet lab where they were, because science is at such a point we might learn something useful from smallpox in the future.
Mm-hmm.
It's not an argument that I find convincing, but obviously powers that be decided it was convincing. I'm sure that at that period of time there was also some, well, we could be sure that we destroyed all of ours. Could we be sure that the Soviet Union destroyed all of theirs?
Is there anyone or anything anyone could do? Say you're on a subway, say something was released. Is there anything you can do short of having, protective gas masks or antibiotics pumping through your body or some kind of protective suit that, keeps the virus out? Is there anything someone could do, like a wet cloth over the mouth or anything as they try to get out? Is there anything someone could do to buy themselves time?
That helps. Yeah. A wet cloth helps.
Okay.
It's not, it's not as good as a filter. It's just like COVID,
Mm-hmm.
anything was better than nothing.
Yeah.
viruses typically only enter the body through breathing it in or a cut. To have a chemical attack that would really affect hundreds of thousands of people, the quantity that you would have to be massive, and it would have to be effectively delivered. And the same thing is true about biologicals in that you have to be able to get them to people who would breathe them in, typically. And, a house is a barrier. That's why we all went into our houses during COVID. It's in the beginning, don't go outside.
When you're talking about delivery, because you're talking about terrorists, like things that explode, like a show, for biological and chemical weapons, is the delivery just silent? Like you just don't know you're walking into this? Or is there some kind of, like you said, delivery method where it becomes obvious? Like if they always say people, when you're out in the subway, look for bags that aren't claimed, right? For explosives, right? There's things you look for. With chemical and biological, is it you just don't have that kind of...
What do we know? We know that most chemicals are delivered through explosives. You explode them out of a shell, typically.
Mm-hmm.
Biologicals, you can't do that because they typically will die.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a living organism and you're exploding it or doing it, and both between the heat and the explosion, it's not a particularly good delivery mechanism. That's true of most biological weapons.
Okay.
In the subway in Tokyo, they were able to produce pretty potent chemical weapons, not as good as they could have been. And they had packed plastic bags filled with the chemical. And they put them on the floor of the subway and sort of punctured them with the tip of an umbrella.
Oh.
Then the chemical, because it's volatile, it will disperse in the air. That's what it did. If they have their choice, what do you want to do? And when do you want to do it? So it would take, it took years for Shinrikyo, and they had a lot of money. They had millions of dollars, and they completely failed at producing an effective biological weapon, in part because they had a vaccine strain of anthrax. They didn't have an infective strain. Once you dig into the science, and keep in mind that I'm not a biochemist,
yeah,
you learn all kinds of things, but that was what was happening. And that's, how do you obtain it? Do you have to infiltrate a lab somewhere, or and how do you know what you have unless you infect somebody? That's what I've always thought about in terms of smallpox. When they were worried about the Iraqis having smallpox, it was like, well, they were saying that all of these scientists from the Soviet Union, because they weren't no longer being paid, would gravitate toward the highest bidder for their services, who had worked on the Soviet bioweapons program. It was like, okay, so you buy a sample from somebody, right? How do you know that it's smallpox?
Yeah.
You don't know that it's smallpox unless you infect somebody. Now, Iraq could have done that in its prisons, So these doomsday scenarios, if you will, everybody sort of has their own little hook on it, So
it's so fascinating because everything that I know about it, and probably most people, it's just stuff you've seen in movies. So, right, it's like the secret canister, and they open it up and it seeps out, and then everybody, So it's interesting to have you put it into context and kind of like how it actually has to be delivered, how difficult it is, even with, a lot of people, like you said, warning about, the science is getting easier, it's going to proliferate. It's still, to keep that in context of what actually is possible.
So when Russia piped chemical weapons into the Moscow theater, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but a very fast acting, probably close to fentanyl or a fentanyl derivative into this Moscow theater, because there were Chechen rebels in the theater that had strapped explosives on their body. And so they needed to have something very fast acting so that they wouldn't be able to explode those explosives. So they put all of this stuff in. But in addition to the Chechen rebels, that it killed, I think, about 2/3, 3/4 of the people who were just there to see a play.
Jeez.
And they didn't have any ambulances waiting to do anything to help those people.
Oh.
They just didn't think it through, or they didn't care.
Well, I can't thank you enough for spending the time. It's a fascinating topic. If anybody wants to know more about this topic or about works you've done or books you've published, is there anywhere they can go, any websites they can check out?
So here's my book, Arms Control Policy,
Awesome.
a guide to the issues. People can reach me through my professional email, which is marie.chevrier@rutgers.edu.
Perfect. Thank you again. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Same here, Scott. I really enjoyed talking with you.